if we're designing type, we're designing a system. But then as we're designing the system, we have to design a system to design the system.
Welcome to Hidden Characters, Jamie. You're the first fellow Canadian on the show.
Oh, thanks so much.
Of course. For those who don't yet know, Jamie Chang is a Canadian type designer and letterer. Jamie founded Manic Type, a type foundry that houses Jamie's work that brings textural excitement and a sense of detailed craft to every page his typefaces touch. Jamie and I met when I took his type electives workshop revolved around manipulating Bezier curves. I was impressed by his precision and attention to detail and wanted to have him on to talk about it. I want to start by rewinding to when I took your workshop, Jamie. One of the most common questions that students had, including myself, was they would say, I don't know what's wrong with my design, but it feels wrong. And you see people like Jessica Heish who do refreshes on brand word marks. What are the most common corrections you see that need to be made, or some of the most common culprits for some of that wrongness? And maybe so it's not such a big question, we can keep it in the context of a word mark.
Yeah, of course. I think it's a really great question. I think in terms of keeping it in the context of a word mark, I think a lot of the problems that we generally tend to have with type and word marks and logo design are kind of the same. And that's what makes the question a bit difficult for most people to answer and objectively find solutions to those issues. And I think that's what makes people like Jessica Hish so special, is I think they can address some of the dissonance between the brand and the word mark itself. And often that's really the more challenging aspect to type and lettering. I think generally speaking, the components of a word mark can be broken down to a couple different things. So like how well does it connect to the brand? What form or style or feelings do the letters communicate? How well is it executed? I think in terms of a word mark or a logo, there's a lot of leeway that can be given, especially with the style and the type of design or brand that you guys are going with. Like a more geometric or abstract design can get away with a lot of the letters looking less traditional, like traditional letters. But when it comes to like things that are a bit more calligraphic and script looking logos, a lot of the issues outside of spacing issues are the letters of the logos don't really look like what we expect the letters to look like. And I think that is a lot of a really common issue that can occur with the logos and word marks.
Cool. Yeah, I love that. I think this leads into the next question I wanted to ask you when you mentioned like some characters can really feel traditional, where sometimes it can get to the other side of the spectrum where it's like calligraphic or more expressive. I've heard you mention that one of your goals is to bring interesting texture to the world through your work with Manic Type. Can you talk about why it's so hard to strike a balance between either feeling too traditional or too expressive when it comes to building interesting texture in type design? And maybe just for some context, could you explain what is texture in type design for those who are unfamiliar?
Yeah, of course. I think there are a couple of different ways to look at typographic texture, which can depend a bit on the size of the type that we're kind of viewing at. So often in type design, we can kind of separate the categories of type between text and display. The texture on the text level is a little bit different than how we might describe typographic texture on a display level. So if we're talking about text typefaces, the texture usually as type designers are talking about it, we kind of look at the grayness of the block of text. So a lot of type designers term this as the color of the text. When it comes to making more traditional text typefaces, designers often feel the need to make kind of a bit more even color for the design because it generally the idea is that it's a bit softer on the eyes and a bit easier to read. And on the other side of the coin, the display size, the texture of the type is a bit more of a description of the feeling that the type denotes, perhaps kind of a style. Is it classical? Does it feel like a black letter? Is it grungy? Does it have textural components that make it feel extra grungy? And when it comes to finding things that really strike the right balance, I think it can often go back to kind of some of the previous culprits of wrongness. It's like what form or style or feelings do the letters that we're using communicate, and how well are they executed? So I think a really big thing that helps us find a good balance between these two is trying to find what people are at the moment feel is familiar, because I think people always like what's familiar. And you can kind of create familiarity in the work by incorporating different ways of designing your letter strokes or how you design some of the features of the letters, such as the ink traps or swashes or other different feature shapes of the design. I think it's really quite easy to go overboard on some of these things. And I think that's what a lot of people also have issue with, is trying to create typefaces that are too feature filled, like cluttered in their design space.
I guess now knowing some of the nuances of that type texture, does any of that contribute to what makes a good type pairing? And yeah, I'm curious in your mind what makes a good type pairing.
Yeah, I think it's not that hard to have a good type pairing. I think finding type pairings is a lot like cooking. Like if you know like sweet and sour go together, then you can try different things that are sweet in place of like sugar. You can use honey instead, or you can if you have something sour like vinegar, you can might use lemon. It's kind of the same if you're using like a script typeface that is interchangeable. Like you can kind of find things within the same style and use it in that different palette. I think what's really important when it comes to finding a good type pairing is actually not the ingredients. Like good cooking, it's really like the cook that makes the good food. It's their palate and not exactly what ingredients you have.
Yeah, I love that analogy. And I feel like with some of that sweet and sour, I feel like sometimes people boil that down to like sans serif and serif
Yeah,
together. What are your thoughts on that? Because
I
I
yeah, I think it could definitely go deeper than that. I think it's like what there's a lot of different typefaces that really give you a different mood or can give you a different feeling. And a lot of that can come down to your own personal experience. So that's really what the hard bit of it is. It's like finding a common ground. I think that's really what design is kind of like graphic design, any type of design is designing for somebody else and not for yourself, right? So you have to kind of find what is in the common space and try to incorporate it into your communication.
I also want to ask you, Jamie, about something I've heard you say in the past about how type design is almost more engineering than it is art. And you always hear people talk about like building a system when you're designing type. Can you talk
Yeah.
a little bit about what that means?
Yeah, of course. I think often when we think about like calligraphy and lettering and typographic pursuit, it's we often think about it as like purely artistic forms. But that's not exactly wrong. It's just we kind of forget that the alphabet itself is labeled as a writing system, right? Like we're creating a system. So if we're designing type, we're designing a system. But then as we're designing the system, we have to design a system to design the system, right? Which is kind of where it starts to get a bit more complex and a little bit deeper. And of course, the reasons why we're doing this is to kind of reduce the amount of labor that we're trying to do when we're designing type, because it's a lot of work to manipulate these Bezier curves over and over again. So when we're designing the typeface, or at least an alphabet, there's a lot of repetitive forms in the letters themselves that are what we use to compose the letters. And so perhaps the round stroke or a straight stem or the bowl of a E or A or something like that. They're all different parts of our visual system that we're incorporating into the alphabetic system. And then we're trying to design the systems to design the system. So it can get pretty crazy.
I hear people talk about when they're starting a typeface to build that sort of to start to design the system for designing the typeface.
Yeah.
There's that mention of like control characters of like
Mhm.
the N and O. Is that sort of something that you prescribe to?
Yeah, of course. I think with a lot of the type design methodology, at least for I think what most type designers are taught, is to create those control characters because you're trying to establish a really solid base for your design in terms of the basic shapes of the design, and rather than having to make those changes further down the line. Because if we have, let's say, for instance, you're using the same bowl on the D and the Q and the P, if you're just designing the D to begin with, as you get further along the design, you can kind of just reuse those shapes in the other letters. But if you design them all at the same time, then when you change one, you have to change all of the other ones. So it just makes the process of retrofitting your design a lot more complex.
Sort of thinking of the pieces as like components and like the modularity.
Yeah, yeah, and it's like the more you can stabilize at the beginning of the process, the easier it is later down the line because it's just less complexity that you're introducing to this already very complex system.
Yeah, and I want to shift to some questions that are more geared towards like brand designers. I feel like that's a lot of the audience for the show and sort of myself included.
Sure. Yeah, of
Um,
course.
and so I'm curious, for brand designers, what would you say the extent of knowledge on type design should be?
I think it really depends on what type of brand designer you are. I think the ability to design and customize type can really set your work apart, but it's also kind of bit of a question of like how do you want to distribute your skill points, right? Like you can always get really good at type design, you can get really good at motion, you can get really good at illustration, and these will all really make you a better brand designer. but it's just whether or not you want to focus on that. I think type as a base is really important. I think everybody should be familiar with it, just as a matter of being able to select and taste make in terms of your brand. But otherwise, I think it's just like any other skill, right? So whether or not you think it is important to your process and your work, that I think that's up to a lot of people. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and that's kind of the way I think about it too. So it's reassuring to hear you say that too.
Yeah.
And I feel like for me as a brand designer, one of the sort of benefits of getting my feet wet with type, and I'm by no means anywhere near being a type designer, but has been not necessarily that I'm now able to offer it as like a service. And I mean, sure, it's helped me with my brand design process when I'm making any sort of brand mark, but I feel like the real benefit has come from just building sort of like an eye for type, which serves as valuable for me just in sort of the context of typesetting. And I'm curious if you could talk to what it means to develop and train your eye for detail and how long it took you to develop such a keen eye for detail.
Of course. I think it really depends on person to person. I think there's also a difference between a trained eye for graphic design and then a trained eye for type design, right? Like those are two different formats of design or different categories, right? And I think a good portion of it when it comes to type design is comes from your understanding of the fundamentals, like calligraphy and believe it or not, optical illusions. I think it's a lot of it is innate talent, and then a lot of it is also practice. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess in a lot of ways, there's no kind of shortcuts.
Yeah, it's really hard. I think you can tell when people have a good eye, but it's also it's not enough, right? Like they can have a good eye in one specific aspect, or maybe this one context gives them a view into what they see wrong, but they might not see that in another context, right? So that I think really depends. It's moment to moment.
Yeah, yeah, I love that. And
Yeah.
I actually think that like type design is maybe one of the most underappreciated art forms in that way. Just because I think it requires so much time to even like build that eye. And
Yeah, and I think another thing is like building the eye, but also like the confidence to be objective about your choices.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Yeah, and I feel like in type design, even from like my few engagements, it's one of these things where you have to make so many decisions
yeah,
so quickly that it like your judgment is something that's I find so valuable in that process. Because for me as like a beginner, at every one of those many decisions, I'm like second guessing myself
yeah,
every time.
yeah,
It's like for someone like you, I feel like you've got to a point where like you're very familiar with some of like the roadblocks and how it could lead to issues down the line. And so another question I have for you, Jamie, revolves around when there's a high profile branding project that gets released these days, one of the sort of deliverables is often like a custom typeface because in a lot of ways it's like sort of economical and some people just want something that they can own for
yeah,
themselves too and like just something that's recognizable and associated with them. And so I find when some of these brand projects get released and people make sort of these case studies to help show them and some of these like sizzle reels, I'm curious, as somebody who's very familiar with type design, have you seen any really effective ways for sort of quickly showing off the breadth and capabilities of a typeface? Like, I'm curious, like if you could only have like a 5 second segment to show something that you've put like months of work into, like how would you, I guess the question is like, what are the key things you would show when you're trying to show why a typeface is different than another one?
man, that's so tough. I think personally, my answer would be that the type, as long as it's supporting the brand and the narrative and addressing the audience that it's supposed to address, then it's a good video. Because I think when it comes to type design, it's if you're like it's such a niche field that if you're not interested or don't have any understanding of it, like your appreciation of it like is way lower than somebody who does understand it, right? And it's like, okay, so who are we making this video for? Are we making it for like the type designers? No, we're not really making it for the type designers. So like I understand if the contents of the video don't really address I think it should because I'm not the audience, right? Like, and I totally understand that. I don't think there's a great way to effectively show off a typeface because it's kind of like playing you a 5 second cut of a whole soundtrack of some guy's album, right? Like it's really hard to do that. I think itself is like a supportive character when it comes to brand, and it can really be quite weird when you try to force it the other way. It's like it's I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I feel that.
Yeah.
I also want to ask you too, Jamie, and this is probably the question that I'm personally most excited about, is so one thing I find so fascinating with the whole kind of like canon of type design is how it's so rooted in traditional like writing styles and how it has still to this day like most typefaces are based on some pen. And so because until very recently in sort of like the grand scheme of things, everything's been sort of all like tangible, like sort of printed matter. But now like when type is sort of being delivered more and more often like on the web and sort of you now have to consider sort of like the interactivity of the web and making things responsive. I'm curious sort of your thoughts on if there's anything that's different with these interactive formats when you're sort of using type and maybe like just digital typesetting and I guess I also want to relate this a little bit to your studies at Type and Media at The Hague. I'm curious, sort of like the second half of that, the media aspect
Mhm.
of type, and sort of, yeah, I just want to pick your brain a little bit about how you see type working in interactive formats.
Yeah, of course. I think the main difference between traditional media and like digital media is a time format. We don't really have an added time access on these designs, right? So I think when it comes to ways that we can introduce new ways to use type in digital formats, I think what a lot of people are missing out on is probably variable fonts because it's designed to enable all of those things and also be, depending on the design, responsive in terms of the design, right? So in the sense that if you have a narrow window and you have a regular window and you try to make it narrow, then the font itself would also turn into a narrow version of the font. I think the variable fonts of themselves are really great for animation because they have that capability to be different in different moments. And I think other than that, perhaps not exactly addressing the digital format. I think what a lot of designers miss out on is using the open type features of a typeface. There are a lot of different components of a typeface that are designed that are kind of behind the veil, so to speak. And there are a lot of different alternate characters that we kind of put into typefaces that can expand the utility of the typeface in different scenarios, which I think can really have a light sh shined on it.
I'm curious, just when you say like the utility,
Yeah.
are you referring like in a lot of cases to something like ligatures, or what are some of the things that people can sort of keep an eye out for to maximize their sort of utility of the typefaces they have?
Yeah, of course. So for instance, my typefaces, I try to add essentially a different style into the typefaces a lot of the time. Like, for instance, my typeface Antic has both grotesque letters and also a humanist letter form. So if you guys aren't too familiar with those terms, it would be a sans serif typeface that is kind of inspired by the pointed pen, and then the humanist would be a sans serif kind of inspired by a broad nib pen. So it introduces a lot of additional flavors. I think if you are able to dive into some of the specimens or websites that the type foundries provide, you'd be able to find some examples of how the open type features are used and suggestions on how to incorporate them into your workflow.
I feel like that's an underrated sort of advice too. I'm somebody who's only as of recently been getting deep into the specimens when I'm like interested in purchasing a typeface or
Yeah,
even trying to maximize the ones I have. Like even seeing things like stylistically when typefaces offer like a two-story A or like just small things like that that can maybe for a certain context can help you better match the style you're after.
yeah, and it's like the added utility is that you're able to kind of have a different voice in different circumstances and contexts for a brand that may perhaps not want a double story A because it's too formal and is not suitable for some child's, you know, nursery or whatever. It just enables you to have different ways of addressing different aspects of the design.
Yeah, like I absolutely love that because I feel like in a lot of ways some of these like subtleties are like hard coded subconsciously, even for like non-designers. I feel like when you see like the two-story A, you kind of associate it with like the Times New Roman, like these big
Yeah.
A's and stuff. And I feel like even if you're not conscious of it, I feel like those things like sort of impute their qualities in a way.
I think that's the great thing about like type design and letters and all that stuff is like I tend to think about designing type design as like designing a soundtrack for like I'm a composer for movies, you know? Like and if I can subtly change your feeling on what this moment is based off of just what the shape of this letter can do, like that's pretty cool.
Yeah, it is pretty magical when you can sort of like will something into feeling what is appropriate for a given
Yeah.
context.
Yeah.
I feel like that's like a real skill.
Yeah, it's super cool. Love it.
I'm going to briefly break from my conversation with Jamie to tell you about the sponsor of today's episode, Drawdown Books. Drawdown publishes and sells books about graphic design, typography, illustration, photography, art, and architecture. When it comes to graphic design, they carry everything from the classics like The Elements of Typographic Style by Robert Bringhurst to Grid Systems by Joseph Miller Brockman, all the way to the newest of releases. I believe that books may be the very best way to learn about design and its history, and I certainly practice what I preach and have ordered from Drawdown countless times in the past. If you too are interested in learning about design through books, I highly recommend you check out their collection on their website at draw-down.com, which is also in the description. And now back to my conversation with Jamie. So one thing I also want to bring up, Jamie, is like when I was taking that course with you, I just noticed like just how proficient you are with glyphs. Like you're whizzing around. And like
Thanks.
for me, my sort of bread and butter programs are like Photoshop and Illustrator. And I feel like for me personally, having sort of a high level of proficiency in whatever program is relevant to what you're doing, I find that's almost like necessary as opposed to like a nice to have, just because like timelines get truncated these days and like it's hard to sort of do sort of justice in like an exploration and really end up with something interesting if you haven't sort of had the time to explore these things, which you can only do with some level of proficiency.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, like for the person who is really trying to up their skills in glyphs and sort of like quote unquote master the tool, from someone like yourself who's gone to two of the most like prestigious type programs arguably in the world, I'm curious if there's any advice you would give and sort of anything you've picked up along the way that isn't just sort of like the good old practice and commitment to using them.
Yeah, I think that's also a hard question because I think you want the person you hire to do this thing to know how to use the tool, right? Like it would be crazy if you hired somebody and they didn't know how to use the tool. Like you wouldn't hire some guy to do construction and they don't know how to use a hammer. Like that's crazy. But on the other hand, I think there's a lot of different ways that you can be efficient with your practice. Obviously, learn how to vector because that's really important in terms of how to design type, because most of the type design programs are based off of Bezier curves. And read the manual is also very important, and practice a lot. But I think when it comes to learning how to vector, there's ways to do it that help you learn how to be precise and how to be clean with your vectors. So when I was, I think in like high school, early uni, I was practicing vectoring like random shapes on like Illustrator. And it was simply just to learn how to vector a shape with less points because that would be less annoying to deal with down the line. And that practice actually turned out to be great when I started to learn how to do type design because the whole point of, I mean, I shouldn't say the whole point, but a large portion of designing a typeface is being efficient with your Bezier points and how to manipulate them in a way that is efficient. Um, yeah, and a lot of that does come with practicing and also understanding where you're putting the points. I think it's really easy to fiddle with all these little points and really not know where they're supposed to go. But I think that's also learning from calligraphy and lettering and looking at other examples and try to recreate those. I think a great way to learn how to do type design and learning how to vector type design would be to copy a typeface that you like. I think a lot of people, in the same way that they want to make a song without knowing like how to drum or how to like right, like they just want to make something cool, but they don't understand that there's a process or there's some certain aspects that are kind of rooted into our understanding of that practice that it would be hard to take away, such as calligraphy and all that stuff. The letters are based off of how we write. If we take away that aspect, and that kind of takes away our understanding of how the letter should look like in the first place. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. I feel like there are some like foundational like bearings when it comes to type design
Yeah.
and like almost like there's almost a level of objectivity to it where it's not
Almost.
almost
Almost.
almost it's
Almost.
like you don't want to cross that line or else it's like a
Yeah.
take,
But
but
yeah. Yeah, like I've had a lot of conversations with some older teachers or professors that where they try not to imbue how they shape their letters, but they want to help you learn how to see, which
Mm.
is kind of a a mind fuck, pardon my expression. It's really hard to grasp in that sense because they're trying to teach you how to design without actually physically teaching you how to design, right? Like they don't want to make your stuff look like their stuff. They want your stuff to still look like your stuff and their stuff to still look like their stuff, but they want you to do it well. And it's like, how do you do that? Yeah,
It's
it's
I totally understand what you mean, and like that's a yeah, it's tough. And I feel like some of those exercises where like you draw in like just the negative space maybe are rooted in some of that.
yeah, it's like they're trying to strip away the exercise to some of the root concepts, and you take away whatever you take away from it, right? Like
Yeah.
it's made to be somewhat ambiguous so that you don't really end up falling for some of the traps that being too rooted in kind of these fundamentals can take you. Because calligraphy in itself doesn't suit text typefaces or digital typefaces, right? Like it's not the same medium. Like the way that light comes off a screen affects how we see the letters, whereas there's no light coming off the page, so it affects the way we see those letters differently. So we're kind of designing for different contexts and also understanding that's also another thing. So yeah.
Yeah. And another question I have for you, what fidelity does your sketch or whatever your idea is prior to coming into to like glyphs need
Right.
to be at prior to you even having any anchor points involved? Because sometimes I see like when I see people working in glyphs, whether I'm like watching a video or even just like from me interacting with people on projects, you sometimes see like the sketch like layered behind as an image.
Yeah.
Are you one of those people who's like trying to follow like a sketch one to one? Or is there, I know you sort of like in your last answer, like advised against just like pushing pixels around, but is
Yeah.
there some level of that that's just like necessary to get things right? Or yeah, I'm curious.
Um, I think that depends on your experience level. So in terms of the fidelity of sketch that I have in terms of getting it to the next level, I think it's about like the 60-70% level. I don't think I'd necessarily need it to be perfectly rendered because there's so many changes that happen from the sketch to the typeface that it's not exactly always going to translate one to one. So there's no point getting it to that level of fidelity, right? I think what we're addressing a lot of the times in the sketch is the structural components of the design and not so much the consistency, if that makes sense. I think at least my level, I'm essentially sketching in glyphs. So I have a good idea of maybe two, three letters and what they look like, and I can kind of sketch with Bezier points without having to do it on paper because one, it's already in the program that I'm going to be designing it in, and two, I can kind of almost be faster in a digital format than I am with my hands. But there's another thing that can be said for losing a bit of the charm that is in the hand rendered sketches, where if you're not, if like a common trap for people to fall into when they're designing digital typefaces is to reuse different shapes from different letters. But if you're doing that at too early of a stage, then you can get into a place where the it's just not fleshed out, you know, like the design's just not fleshed out and you haven't had that level of development in the shapes for it to feel complete yet. So it's something that you kind of have to gauge with the level of experience that just comes with time. Yeah.
It seems like whether it's on paper structurally or in your head structurally, there needs to be that structure,
Yeah.
or it's gonna, or you're gonna end up just
Yeah.
pushing
And,
pixels.
and yeah, exactly. It's like if you the structure helps guide where your placement of your vector points should be, and I think it's uh, indispensable to have.
Nice. Yeah, I love that. And I also want to ask you, Jamie, sort of like the controversial AI question.
Yeah.
AI for me in like terms of graphic design and type design is specifically interesting in type design for me because of that idea of like a system and
Mhm.
like, you establish sort of like some core features of the modularity and then you sort of like carry that through to sort of like a full character set. In
Yeah.
my head, that seems like
Doable, right?
Yeah,
Like that
like
that's
something
like
that like
something that's gonna come.
something where like automation would benefit that
Yeah,
process.
yeah.
And so I'm curious like how you see sort of typefaces evolving, whether it's like the process itself becoming like I don't know if I like the word easier, but like but sort of
Streamlined?
what's that?
Streamlined?
Yeah, streamline. That's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
But I'm also curious too, not necessarily just from the perspective of it being streamlined, but I'm curious like typefaces are, I see them as like tools. And so in
Yeah.
the same way that like when you were describing with the sort of question about like digital typesetting, how there's like variable accesses that could benefit sort of like some of that responsiveness.
Mhm.
I'm curious like how do you see that idea of utility expanding because of generative tools, if
Sure.
at all? And like, is there a world where, and maybe this is just an absurd example, but is there a world where there's ever a typeface with like 100 axes?
I I I'm pretty sure one of my profs did something with like 50 something axes. But the idea is there. The only question is why do you need it? Especially if we're talking about like a typeface with 100 axes is what is the point of it? Like what are we doing with this? And if there's a reason for it, then sure. When it comes to like AI and type design, I think well, first of all, I've been sticking my head in the dirt. So I've been trying to avoid too much thinking about it too much because I think especially in the field that I'm in, like type design is almost akin to another like other crafts. And when you come to a point where there's a technology that can kind of essentially replace the craft, it's like, okay, how do we address this, right? Like there's already so many different facets that AI has been impacting the creative industry that it's really hard to see where it goes and what kind of steps we're going to put into to make ourselves still valuable as human beings. Um, I think the precision of type is it makes it a bit difficult for AI to replicate, but I can definitely see like how you said AI turns into a bit of an assistive design tool, right? Like it's helps us streamline the process and stuff like that. But I think it's hard to say where we're going to be in like a year or two or three, like it's AI is crazy.
Yeah, I feel that. But I really like what you said about like the craft component to it, because in the same way that we were talking about sort of like in the last question about you need that structure to start, I feel like getting to the point where you have that structure isn't like a given. Like
Hmm,
some of the choices that are made to even get to a point where you have a structure and like a concept that makes sense, I feel like comes from an informed place,
for sure.
from being like very familiar with
Yeah.
sort of like what you're after. And like that is a skill that like in my head cannot be replaced.
I think that's 100% fair. I think the only question is how much do other people give a shit,
Yeah. I
right? Like
yeah.
I totally see it. It's just look if there's an AI that can pump out 50 typefaces in an hour, and you just have to pick one of them that kind of look okay, like people are going to be okay with it.
I
Unfortunately, yeah, it's hard to see where this is all going for sure.
yeah, and it's crazy because it's not like it's an outlook of like 10 years. It's like an outlook of like
A
could be like
year or
6
two.
months.
I know. Yeah, like
Pretty crazy.
freaking like accountants are losing their jobs, man. Like
Yeah,
like what are we doing?
it's insane. And but
Yeah.
I feel like the saving grace, and maybe to end on like a positive note for this question, is like I Brian Collins said recently, he's like AI will make bad designers worse and good designers better.
Yeah, sure.
Something that I sort of like ascribe to. So
Yeah. I definitely think that as well. But then that just like it's not that we're not gonna have these things anymore. It's just we're gonna have way fewer people doing it.
yeah.
But then it's like what is everybody else gonna do?
Yeah, it's such a strange thing because if you only like yeah, if you sort of take the bottom out and you only have some of the masters, like
Yeah, and these guys are going to be fine, like
yeah,
it's more of a name thing than it is their work half the
yeah,
time. So it's like, yeah, they're going to be fine. And it's just AI is affecting everybody, and I think it's just hard to understand it or try to reason with it all because it's not something that anybody's ever dealt with before, especially with at this time scale, right? Like it's
yeah.
crazy.
Yeah, and I guess like the tough thing is when the bottom gets taken out of some of these industries, what is the road to becoming the senior level?
Yeah, because
Sort
there's
of like
nothing there.
there's no path in the jungle to to that role, you know, like
Yeah.
yeah, it's an
Shit's
interesting
wild.
time and we'll see only time will tell, right? So
Yeah. Maybe we'll come back around on this in 2 years.
yeah, exactly. We might just be both full-time podcasting at that point.
Oh man, yeah, like honestly, like 80% of the world might be.
But you might be my co-host.
Yeah. Let's do it.
But yeah, I
Holy
also
shit.
want to ask you, Jamie, like almost like the who's your favorite rapper's favorite rapper question.
Sure.
Like what design or type boundaries are you sort of like have your eye on these days? And one thing that I love to do always, like whenever there's like a cohort graduating from type and media, I always like to
Mm.
go to that website that they always do,
Yeah.
find some like great people from that website.
Yeah.
One
I
person
have
that
terrible haircut on my site. I had COVID hair and I had to record it in my bedroom. It was so bad. All right, sorry.
no,
Continue.
you're good, you're good. I
This
didn't even
interesting
know.
anecdote.
But one foundry I came across recently, and they were grads from the program, was like the Chic Toika. I don't know if I'm
Sure.
saying
Yeah.
that, but I love that work. And so I'm curious,
Yeah.
like whether it's somebody from that program or just somebody you've come across from other means, like who do you have your eyes on these days?
Honestly, like I think my personal interests are probably a bit more different than most designers just because I'm in a different field essentially, right? Like this is my jam. Like I like listening to the experimental shit, but like in the
Yeah,
same
yeah.
sense. So I think my interests will be a bit more different. I always love James Edmondson's work, like Ono Type Co. A lot of the inspiration or the feeling that I'm trying to imbue into my work is kind of the work from the Jugendstil art, like arts and letters time. Like, do you know
I'm
Jugendstil?
unfamiliar
So
now.
Jugendstil is like the arts and letters of the lowlands, of
Okay.
like the Dutch and lowland Germany stuff. So it's a bit more like dark fantasy vibe, but also still a bit Art Nouveau arts and letters, or arts and letters or arts and crafts. I forget. There's the
For
British
arts and
one is
crafts, I think.
arts and crafts. Yeah,
Yeah.
arts and crafts. Yeah, yeah. So, and I think a lot of the people that I tend to look up to in terms of their work are people who are able to imbue those feelings into their work. So James Edmondson. I also like the work of Alec Ter, Thais Hertzberg.
I haven't heard of him.
I think he's in New Orleans, and also Morula Type. I think he works with the contemporary type people and also
Okay.
maybe Pangram, but I'm not sure. I don't remember exactly. But yeah, their work is always really cool and you should check it out.
Yeah, I love that. I'm happy to hear some like unfamiliar names. I like what you said about you're looking for like the experimental stuff
Yeah.
and
Yeah,
like
it's just
the
because
acquired taste. The type
yeah.
the taste where you have to had gone to type and media to get it.
Look, I'm not the one who said it. You said it. But in terms of like finding inspiration for work, I think it's especially in this day and age, we're kind of past not I wouldn't say that like creating a very like neutral sans serif stuff isn't worth it anymore, but it's just not as interesting and as engaging in terms of a aesthetic difference, right? Like we're we're at a point where there's probably like 50 Helveticas and there's all minor nuances and different feelings of how they come across and stuff like that. So when I'm looking for inspiration, I'm looking for things that I haven't exactly seen before maybe, or they're able to give off feelings that are just a little different, and it just gives me something to add to my own toolbox when it comes to creating new stuff.
I hope this is a compliment, but in my sort of like mental diagramming of type foundries, I put you with Ono type. Or I put
Oh,
Manic
thanks so much.
type. So
Yeah. Yeah, I appreciate it.
I see that vision of like, no, genuinely like that sort of like aesthetic. And
Yeah.
I didn't know totally like where it was rooted from, but like I totally see that like that style
Yeah.
ingrained in my head.
Yeah,
So
and honestly, like Ono, James' work is largely, I think, influenced by Jugendstil stuff as well, in terms of the vibe. So yeah, definitely check it out if you're interested in art history and stuff like that. Yeah, it's good. It's a good era to look into.
yeah, and I actually like one of the reasons that we even came like cross paths was when I took your workshop after having had read James Edmonds sort of like PDF. I don't know if you know what I'm
Oh
talking
yeah.
about, like his like A to
Oh,
Z.
interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
It almost like opened my doors. I'm like, I know there's like a world here, and I'm trying to like
Yeah. Just
understand it or sort of like take a
peek
step
into it a
in.
bit.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And I like came across like James Edmondson's like PDF sort of intro to type design.
Hmm. Hmm.
And that's what made me like want to explore further. And then I came across like type electives workshops.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, I didn't know that.
This question might be a little bit out of your wheelhouse, Jamie, but I'm curious from the brand designer perspective. I always want to pick your brain about like some of the brand design stuff like in your head, just because as somebody who's like has such a grasp of type and like an appreciation for it, I'm
Yeah.
curious like if there's any branding projects from like the past little while that have come out that have really caught your attention.
The sad thing about all this stuff is that the ones that catch your attention are the bad ones, right? Like if it's good,
Fair
it's
enough.
like
Fair enough.
you're
I guess
like,
I should
damn, that's
caveat
good.
that saying just the good stuff. Just
Like I'm so bad with all this stuff that it's hard for me to remember. Yeah, honestly, I think if it's good, it's semi not memorable. I think depending on who you're talking to, right? And maybe that's just how it is. If your work's good, nobody's gonna say shit about it, which is how it goes. Same thing with type design, you know?
fair enough. Good design is invisible, I guess.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, those are all the questions I had for you. Jamie, thanks so much for all the thoughtful answers.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it.
Yeah,
It's always great to talk to people about type design and try to introduce them to some of the things that we think about.
I want to encourage people to sort of go down that same path I went down, like even just starting with the James Edmondson stuff, getting people to appreciate type because I feel like it's done a lot of wonders for me, even just like what I said about helping me improve my general like understanding of typography and typesetting. So yeah, it was my pleasure to have you on, and I always finish Jamie with a segment that's in the spirit of why the show started, to give recognition to designers contributing to impressive projects. So I'm curious if there's anybody who you want to spotlight and who you think would be a great guest on the show.
I think any of the people I brought up earlier would be great. I think people who are at the intersection of type design and graphic design, let me think of some people. Jen Ramirez, a friend of mine, he also runs Letristica, which is the Mexican type conference that happens every year, and he runs a type foundry called Dual Type with his wife. He would also be great to have on because I think he would have a lot of insight into the different aspects of the type design ecosystem, I guess. Yeah.
Cool. Is he the husband of Zrinka?
Yes. Yes,
Okay,
he is.
that's why the name's familiar because I
Yeah.
took a course with Zrinka at Type at Cooper.
Yeah, cool. Yeah. Yeah. They're friends of
Yeah.
mine. They're super cool.
Okay,
Yeah.
cool. Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
if you're listening, I'd love to have you on.
Yeah.
But yeah, with that, Jamie, thanks so much for coming on and take care.
Yeah. Thanks so much.
See ya. Hey, I'm jumping back in to say thank you so much for watching until the end. I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Jamie and learned something new about type or type design along the way. If you enjoyed what Jamie had to share, but are interested in learning about type design in a more practical, hands-on way, Jamie is teaching an online Foundations of Type Design course at the start of April, which is next month if you're watching this episode shortly after its release. I'm in no way endorsed to recommend the course. I'm instead someone who has taken Jamie's courses in the past out of pocket and have found them to be full of value. So if you're interested, the link to his course will be in the description down below. And if you're someone who's tuning in after watching my first 5 episodes, thank you. I appreciate your patience between this episode and the last one. The hiatus was a result of me starting a new role, which has kept me very busy. But with that said, I've learned a lot from this new role, which I plan to bring to the show and maybe even feature some of the talented designers I've been working with. And I'm also over the moon about some of the episodes which are already recorded. I dug deep to ask some thoughtful questions to some very talented designers, and I cannot wait for you to experience those episodes. So, the best way to stay in the loop and to know when those episodes are available is to subscribe, which is also the best way to support the show. So, it would go a long way if you took the time to do that. And so, I'll see you when those episodes release. Thanks and chat then. Bye.